Welcome, dear listener. Today, we drift back into the rugged world of the Wild West, a place of shadows, survival, and forgotten stories waiting to be told. In the forgotten corners of the Wild West, where the air was heavy with dust and the silence of open plains stretched far beyond the horizon, nights came alive with sounds both familiar and unsettling. The howl of coyotes echoed in the distance, a reminder that untamed wilderness still pressed close against the fragile edge of civilization. Wooden towns, built hastily along wagon trails, railroads, or mining camps, seemed to breathe with the restless energy of men who had traveled far, carrying both fortune and desperation in their pockets. In these towns, the saloon stood as the pulsing heart of nightly life, drawing in drifters, gamblers, and cowboys alike. Inside, smoke curled upward from cheap cigars, the sharp bite of whiskey hung in the air, and the sound of boots scraping across rough planks blended with fiddle music and raucous laughter. Yet behind the saloons, tucked into dimly lit houses where lace curtains tried in vain to soften reality, lived another world entirely. This was the world of the brothel, a place often whispered about but rarely spoken of openly. It was here that women, pushed by poverty, circumstance, or broken dreams, sought a means to survive. Their lives were not the romanticized tales sometimes spun in novels or films. They were raw, dangerous, and laced with constant uncertainty. To step into that life meant stepping onto a path where each night could bring coin, but also calamity. And for many of these women, every evening was not just about earning their bread, but about surviving the long hours until dawn. Imagine walking through one of these towns as twilight descends. The sun has fallen, leaving streaks of red and orange fading behind the jagged outline of distant mountains. Dust still lingers in the air, stirred by the wheels of wagons and the hooves of horses. As lamps are lit in windows, the glow of kerosene flickers uncertainly, throwing uneven light onto the dirt streets. You would hear the strains of piano music drifting from the saloon doors, see shadows gathered along the porches, and sense the unpredictable mood of men who carried revolvers on their hips and liquor in their veins. The town feels alive, but it also feels dangerous, as though violence could break out at any moment, sparked by a glance or a careless word. Now step closer to the brothel itself, a two-story wooden building painted in colors that once were bright but now are faded by sun and dust. Its porches swept clean, though the boards creak with age. Inside, the air is warm and heavy, scented with perfume that barely masks the harsher smells of alcohol and sweat. Oil lamps burn low, casting a golden haze across the parlor. Velvet curtains hang by the windows, and chairs are arranged where men might sit, sipping from glasses and waiting for company. The women appear here, dressed in gowns of silk or satin, often hand-me-downs or stitched together many times over, but still shimmering beneath the lamplight. They smile, laugh, and tease with practiced charm. Yet behind their eyes lies caution. They know that every man who enters may be generous, or cruel, or worse. Survival depends on telling the difference. The life of these women was not chosen in joy. Many came west following promises that turned false. Some were widows left destitute by war, others runaways escaping brutal homes. Still others lured by advertisements promising respectable employment that dissolved into exploitation. In the brothel, they became part of a hidden economy that the towns depended on but pretended not to see. Cowboys spent their wages here, miners emptied their gold dust, drifters gambled their last coins. And yet, for all the money that passed through those rooms, little security came to the women themselves. A night might end with laughter and fortune, or it might end in blood. The madame of the house, often a woman who had once worked in those same rooms, ruled with a mixture of strictness and care. She managed the business, protected the women when she could, and taught them the rules of survival. She might warn them to keep their eyes sharp, to notice which men were armed, which were drunk, which were quiet but dangerous. She knew that violence could erupt not only in the saloon, but within the brothel walls themselves. Her task was to keep order in a place where chaos always threatened. For the women under her charge, the madame could be both protector and jailer. She provided a roof, food, and some measure of safety, but she also took her share of their earnings and held power over their fates. When night fell, the true gamble began. Outside, the town roared with music and drunken shouts. Inside, the women prepared themselves as though for battle, though their weapons were smiles, laughter, and careful words. They powdered their faces, adjusted their gowns, and stepped into the parlor where strangers waited. Each encounter carried risk. Some men came seeking nothing more than company, grateful for a soft voice or a listening ear after long weeks on the trail. Others came with anger simmering beneath their skin, quick to lash out at the slightest slight. And still others came with hearts blackened by cruelty, eager to take what they wanted regardless of cost. For the women, survival meant watching closely, listening carefully, and learning to sense danger before it fully arrived. They noticed the way a man gripped his glass, the way his laughter rose too loudly, the way his eyes failed to focus. They learned to soothe tempers with gentle words, to steer conversations away from conflict, to distract men from violence with the promise of comfort. Yet no matter how skilled they became, the threat always lingered. A pistol could be drawn in an instant, a knife could flash from the shadows, and sometimes no words could prevent the storm. The rooms themselves bore silent witness to this life. Small, dimly lit chambers lined with narrow beds and washstands, their walls papered in fading patterns. Quilts stitched by tired hands covered mattresses that sagged with age. A single lamp burned low, casting shadows that stretched long into the corners. It was in these rooms that women earned their keep, where laughter was feigned, where secrets were whispered, where tears were sometimes shed in silence after the door closed. Each room carried stories untold, fragments of lives both broken and enduring. Outside those walls, society judged harshly. The church might condemn, respectable women might look away, yet the town itself relied on these brothels more than it admitted. Without them, many men would seek release in violence elsewhere. Without them, the saloons would lose patrons, the towns would lose revenue. The women bore the stigma, yet they also bore the burden of holding up an invisible pillar of frontier life. They were outcasts, yet essential. Scorned, yet needed, and in this paradox, they lived each night with courage unrecognized. As you listen now, imagine their footsteps on creaking stairs, the soft murmur of voices behind closed doors, the sudden burst of laughter or anger carried through thin walls. Imagine the tension that never fully lifted, the knowledge that the next knock on the door might bring kindness or disaster. This was the atmosphere in which they survived, night after night, year after year. It was a life of fragile balance, one misstep away from tragedy, and yet, in the midst of danger, there was resilience. These women learned to endure. They found strength in small rituals, brushing out their hair at the end of the night, writing letters that might never be sent, whispering prayers before sleep. Some kept tiny keepsakes hidden beneath their pillows, a locket, a ribbon, a photograph that reminded them of who they once were or who they still hoped to become. Others found comfort in the companionship of fellow workers, sharing whispered jokes, consoling each other after rough encounters, forming bonds of sisterhood stronger than the walls around them. To understand their lives is to step into a world often hidden from history books. It is to see not just the glamour or scandal, but the human cost and the daily struggle. it is to recognize that these women were not faceless figures in dim parlors, but human beings with hopes, fears, and extraordinary endurance. They lived through nights where survival was uncertain, where violence was always near, and where each dawn was a small victory. And so, as the night deepened across the frontier, as lanterns burned low and the sounds of revelry slowly faded, the women of the brothel prepared to face the hours ahead. For them, every evening was a test of wit, courage, and fortune. Each moment demanded vigilance, and each breath carried the weight of survival. They were not merely workers of the night. They were fighters in their own right, holding their ground against the chaos of a lawless land, enduring with strength unseen. Their story begins here, in the glow of lamplight, in the hush of whispered voices, in the fragile courage that carried them through the deadliest nights of the Wild West. When the lamps flickered low and the music from the saloon swelled into the dusty streets, the true gamble of the evening began. For the women who worked in the brothels, the first knock at the door was never just the arrival of a customer. It was the opening hand in a dangerous game, a silent roll of the dice that determined whether the night would pass quietly or descend into chaos. Each evening was a performance, but one that offered no guarantee of safety. Beneath every smile was calculation, behind every laugh was caution, and within every word spoken lingered the awareness that survival was never promised. The men who stepped through the parlor doors came from every walk of Western life. Cowboys rode in fresh from the trail, spurs still clinking against dusty boots, their pockets heavy with wages from weeks of herding cattle across endless plains. Miners stumbled in with hands blackened from coal or stained with the yellow dust of gold, eager to spend in a single night what had taken months to earn. Drifters appeared too, men with nothing to their names but worn coats, hollow eyes, and the hunger for warmth, company, or distraction. Soldiers wandered in from frontier forts, gamblers followed the smoke and music, and lawmen themselves were not immune to the allure of the brothel's lamplight. Each man brought his own story, but the women knew better than to expect kindness from those stories. The frontier hardened men, and that hardness often showed itself in fists, tempers, and guns. To sit in the parlor with them was to sit at the edge of a storm. The air was thick with whiskey, the floorboards sticky with spilled beer, and the noise rose and fell like waves. Laughter one moment, shouting the next, a sudden crash of glass followed by uneasy silence. Women learned to read these shifts as carefully as gamblers studied the fall of cards. A man who entered laughing could turn violent after his second drink. Another who came in quiet and withdrawn might hide a rage that boiled over without warning. Some were tender, grateful even, seeking no more than companionship. Others arrived already consumed by anger, and for them no gentle word could soften the night. The women's survival depended on skillful judgment. A glance was enough to measure a man's state, the way his shoulders slumped, the sharpness of his eyes, the tremble of his hands as he raised his glass. They memorized the subtle language of danger. A voice that grew louder meant tempers rising. Fingers drumming against a table suggested impatience. The sudden shift of a jaw or the narrowing of eyes warned that a man's thoughts had darkened. Each sign was a signal, and those who ignored the signals risked paying dearly for it. But beyond instinct and observation, there was strategy. The brothel was its own theater of survival, where women played roles carefully chosen for each visitor. To the lonely, they became gentle companions, listening to stories of the trail, nodding at tales of cattle drives, offering the comfort of being heard. To the boastful, they became audiences, praising wins at cards or exaggerating admiration for tall tales of adventure. To the violent, they became cautious shadows, answering softly, avoiding confrontation, guiding them with the faintest touch of reassurance toward calm. And to those unpredictable souls who veered between laughter and rage, they became balancing forces, holding the conversation just steady enough to keep disaster at bay. Still, even with all this skill, danger hovered near. A night could be shattered by the slam of a door, by the sudden crack of a gunshot from the saloon next door, or by a drunken brawl that spilled into the brothel itself. For the women, there was no certainty that the evening would end as it began. They lived in the narrow space between control and chaos, aware that no amount of charm could always protect them. Their gamble was not one of cards or dice, but of survival, and the stakes were always life itself. Consider the quiet tension that filled those rooms. Music from a distant piano drifted faintly through the walls, mingling with muffled voices. Oil lamps hissed faintly, their flames shrinking as the night deepened. In this dim glow, faces appeared and disappeared, shadows lengthened, and the women kept themselves alert while still wearing masks of ease. Their bodies leaned gracefully against chair arms, their laughter rang light and practiced, but beneath it all their minds were working, calculating risks, watching, waiting, measuring. To survive the night was to walk a line so fine it could hardly be seen, a tightrope stretched across the abyss of danger. For the customers, the brothel was a place of escape, a shelter from loneliness, a playground for reckless desire, or simply a space to forget the hardships of frontier life. For the women, it was something entirely different. It was a battlefield fought with no soldiers, where victory was not measured in conquest but in survival. Every night survived was a small triumph, every dawn a quiet blessing. They endured the endless gamble because there was little else to do. To leave the brothel meant facing hunger, homelessness, or worse. To remain meant facing danger with each breath. Between these two choices, they chose endurance. There were, of course, men who came with tenderness, the cowboy who had ridden weeks under the sun, yearning for a kind word, the miner who sought not lust but laughter, needing to feel human again after months underground, the gambler who wanted not another game but the comfort of resting his head in a woman's lap, listening to the soft murmur of her voice. These moments offered glimpses of humanity, reminders that not every night was ruled by fear. But even in these moments, caution never lifted entirely. Trust was dangerous, and the women knew better than to surrender to it fully. The line between kindness and cruelty could vanish in the space of a heartbeat. The brothel itself functioned as a delicate system of control, and part of that control lay in routine. There were hours when the parlor filled, hours when doors opened and closed, and hours when silence finally returned. Within this routine, the women developed rituals of their own. They whispered warnings to one another when a man's mood grew dark, shared quick glances that communicated more than words, and positioned themselves in ways that allowed for a quick escape if needed. Some kept routes mapped in their minds, the quickest way to a door, the sharpest turn through the hallways, the safest path to the madam's office where help might be found. It was a choreography of survival, as rehearsed and essential as any dance on a stage. Yet even with strategy and ritual, uncertainty reigned. Nights stretched long, hours slow, and every moment could pivot without warning. To gamble in cards was to risk money. To gamble in the brothel was to risk life. Each woman understood that, and still they came, still they endured, because for many there was no other choice. Survival in the Wild West was a harsh bargain, and theirs was one of the harshest. Think of the silence that followed when doors closed at last. The men gone, the lamps burning low, the night air cool against tired skin. The women gathered sometimes in the kitchen or in one another's rooms, whispering about the night, sharing stories of narrow escapes, laughing in relief when fortune had smiled. These moments were rare breaths of ease, the release that came after hours of vigilance. And yet, even then, their rest was never certain. Another knock might come. Another cry from the street might break their peace. The gamble was never truly finished until dawn arrived, and so, night after night, these women played the game that life had forced upon them. They read the faces of strangers, they learned the rhythms of danger, they guarded themselves with masks of laughter and eyes that missed nothing. They lived in a world where trust was scarce, where violence lingered always at the edge of sound, where the difference between surviving and falling lay in a glance, a word, a single choice made in silence. They gambled everything on endurance, and by surviving, they proved themselves not only workers of the night, but warriors of an unseen battlefield. Though most women who worked in the brothels of the Wild West wore no uniforms and carried no shields, they were far from defenseless. Survival demanded it. The very act of stepping into the parlor each night meant accepting that danger could appear at any moment, and danger often came in the form of the men who sought them. A cowboy with too much whiskey in his blood, a miner quick to anger, a soldier restless with violence, a drifter who had nothing to lose, all could become threats in an instant. And so the women learned, they adapted, and they armed themselves in ways both visible and unseen. Some hid weapons beneath the folds of skirts and gowns, small pistols tucked into garters or pressed close to thighs. These pistols were not meant to challenge a man to a duel. They were meant for a single shot fired in desperation, a chance to break free and run. Others preferred the silent assurance of knives, slender blades concealed beneath pillows, hidden in bodices or strapped against the calf. Even a hairpin, sharpened and ready, could serve as a last defense when the night turned dangerous. Yet it was not steel alone that kept them alive. The sharpest weapon was always vigilance. A woman who survived long in the brothel was not simply quick with her hands, but quicker with her eyes. She learned to notice everything, the twitch of a man's jaw as he grew agitated, the way his fingers brushed too often near the handle of a revolver, the sudden silence that fell when his laughter had been too loud a moment before. Each gesture was a signal, and she learned to read these signals as carefully as a gambler read the turn of cards. To misread them was to invite disaster. To read them well was to hold one more thread of control in a place where control was fragile. The rooms of the brothel were arranged not only for pleasure, but also for defense. Lamps glowed dimly, but many women kept shadows deep enough that their hands could reach for hidden weapons without being seen. Washstands and small tables became barriers in emergencies, obstacles that could buy precious seconds. Some insisted that doors never be fully closed, leaving a sliver of light and sound from the hallway so that others might hear if something went wrong. The madams, too, played their part, instructing the women in these subtle defenses, reminding them that survival was not luck but practice, not chance but awareness. A madame who had seen enough violence knew that her house was safer when her women were prepared. Still, weapons and plans could only do so much. Often, it was the strength of alliances that protected them most. Bartenders in the saloon nearby hired guards at the doors, loyal customers who respected the women. All were part of an invisible network of survival. A bartender who spotted trouble might send word ahead that a dangerous man was on his way. A guard might step into a hallway at just the right time. A trusted customer might intervene when tempers flared. Survival was never solitary. It was woven through a web of watchfulness and quiet protection. The women knew who to trust, and they relied on those bonds in moments when their own defenses might fail. For all their readiness, fear was never far away. Imagine the hush that fell when a man's voice suddenly rose too sharp, when his hand slammed against a table, when the sound of a chair scraping against the floor carried through the parlor. In those moments, the women's hearts would quicken, their breaths shallow, every muscle alert. One wrong word could spark violence, one wrong move could endanger lives, and yet, outwardly, they remained calm. They smiled, they soothed, they spoke in tones meant to soften rage. They became actors in their own survival, performing roles that could mean the difference between life and death. But fear did not only come from strangers. Sometimes the greatest danger came from those who were familiar, lawmen who believed their badge granted them power, gamblers who held grudges, even townsfolk who pretended morality by day and carried cruelty by night. These were men whose presence brought unease. The women understood that violence did not always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it was the man who had come before, who had laughed with them, who had left a coin on the table, and who returned another night with anger in his eyes. Familiarity could not be trusted. Trust itself was a luxury they could not afford, and so the women developed instincts not unlike those of wild animals living on the edge of survival. They sensed moods as wolves sensed danger in the wind. They heard threats in tones unspoken, saw danger in gestures too slight for others to notice. This instinct was sharpened night after night until it became second nature. It was their armor, invisible yet always present. It was what allowed them to walk into rooms with men who carried weapons and tempers and still find ways to live through the night. Sometimes, however, even the best instincts failed. Stories lingered of nights when a gun was drawn too quickly, when a knife flashed before anyone could move, when violence erupted so suddenly that no preparation could have stopped it. In these moments, the brothel became a battlefield, cries echoing through narrow hallways, footsteps pounding across wooden floors, doors slamming as women fled for safety. Afterward, silence fell heavy, broken only by sobs or whispered prayers. The walls bore scars of these moments, bullet holes patched clumsily, stains scrubbed away but never forgotten. Survival was not guaranteed, and every woman who worked in those houses knew it. Each night lived was a victory, each dawn seen was a quiet triumph. And yet, for all the violence and fear, there was an unspoken pride in their endurance. They knew that society judged them harshly, that whispers condemned them as immoral, as fallen, as unworthy. But they also knew something that society often ignored, that to survive as they did required strength beyond measure, to face armed men night after night, to endure tempers, to resist violence, to defend themselves with whatever means they had. This was not weakness. This was resilience. The world might not honor them, but in their own hearts they carried the knowledge that they were fighters in a war no one acknowledged. Weapons remained hidden, but not always used. Often it was enough that they existed, enough that the women felt their weight against their skin, a reminder that they were not helpless. A pistol in a garter, a knife beneath a pillow, a razor in a corset. These objects were more than tools. They were symbols of defiance, proof that even in a world determined to break them, they had ways to fight back. Each weapon carried its own story, perhaps bought with hard-earned coins, perhaps handed down by another woman who no longer needed it, perhaps stolen in desperation. Each one was a companion, silent but reassuring, a promise that if the night turned deadly, there was still a chance to survive. But beyond the steel and the shadows, there was another defense, quieter but just as powerful, the power of voice. Words could be shields, laughter could be armor, silence could be as sharp as a blade. The women learned to use their voices with precision, to calm a drunk, to flatter a braggart, to distract a gambler, to soften a soldier's heart. They spoke not only for company, but for survival, crafting sentences as carefully as a blacksmith forged steel. A single phrase, spoken at the right moment, could prevent a hand from reaching a holster, could ease the tension in a clenched jaw, could turn the tide of danger. Their words, honed through endless nights, became weapons as vital as any hidden pistol. And yet, in the quiet hours when the lamps were extinguished and the last voices faded, the women reflected on how thin that line of safety truly was. They knew that the world outside saw them only as shadows in dim parlors, but they knew themselves as survivors of countless trials. They carried scars, some visible, some hidden deep, but those scars were also marks of resilience. They had lived through nights when danger pressed close, when weapons were drawn, when fear sat heavy in their throats, and still they endured. Their endurance was their legacy, their courage unspoken but undeniable. Each night was a lesson, each dawn a reminder. To live as they did was to accept constant risk, to dwell always in the presence of danger. But it was also to prove again and again that even in the darkest rooms, even in the deadliest nights, strength could shine quietly, unseen by the world, but felt in every heartbeat that survived until morning. Survival in the brothels of the Wild West was never only a matter of facing violence, for danger did not always arrive with a shout or a gunshot. Some of the most relentless threats came quietly, slipping unseen into the very air the women breathed, into the water they drank, into the bodies they carried night after night. Illness lingered like an invisible predator in every brothel, creeping through hallways, settling into lungs, hiding in fevered blood. If a pistol could end a life in an instant, disease could steal it slowly, steadily, sometimes over months, sometimes in only days. And this, too, was part of their nightly gamble. The frontier was a harsh place for everyone. Medical knowledge was limited, doctors were scarce, and medicine itself was often little more than a mixture of superstition, alcohol, and guesswork. But for women in the brothels, the risks multiplied. Crowded rooms, endless contact with strangers, exhaustion from long nights, poor diet, and the absence of genuine medical care created conditions where sickness thrived. They lived in houses where air grew stale, where windows were shut tight against the cold, where sheets were washed less often than needed, and where privacy for recovery was almost non-existent. If one woman fell ill, it rarely remained her burden alone. Illness spread quickly, leaping from room to room, carried by touch, by breath, by the constant rhythm of survival. Among the most feared specters was tuberculosis, known simply as consumption. It wasted the body slowly, drawing color from the cheeks, hollowing the eyes, leaving only coughing fits that rattled through the night. In towns where dust filled the lungs and clean air was scarce, consumption cut lives short with merciless regularity. For a woman in the brothel, the coughing fits that shook her chest could not be hidden long. Clients recoiled, the madame grew anxious, and whispers passed through the house like shadows. Many tried to conceal their illness, covering mouths with lace handkerchiefs, claiming only a passing chill, pushing themselves to work even when their bodies longed only for rest. But the disease cared little for pride or secrecy. It spread, it consumed, and too often it carried them to graves unmarked, their names lost in the dust of history. Smallpox haunted the brothels too, striking suddenly, leaving its victims scarred even if they survived. The fever burned, the skin erupted, and in houses where close contact was constant, the risk of contagion was terrifying. Entire brothels sometimes closed their doors for weeks, the rooms silent except for the groans of the sick. Women who survived often bore the marks forever, their beauty scarred, their chances of finding kinder work diminished. In a profession where appearance was currency, smallpox was not only an illness but also a thief of livelihood, stripping away what little advantage these women held in a cruel economy. Yet it was venereal disease that perhaps cast the darkest shadow over their lives, for it was tied directly to the work they performed each night. Syphilis crept in stages, sometimes appearing only as a rash, later attacking the nervous system, leading to madness, blindness, even death. Gonorrhea, untreated, left women infertile or racked with pain. In an age before antibiotics, remedies were few and often dangerous. Some drank mercury solutions, believing the metal would cure them, only to be poisoned slowly from within. Others relied on patent medicines advertised in bold print, bottles filled with alcohol, opium, or herbs that dulled pain but cured nothing. There were whispered remedies passed from woman to woman, secrets of herbs steeped in boiling water, of tinctures mixed with desperation, but most were little more than rituals of hope. Cleanliness became both obsession and defense. Some women washed constantly, scrubbing with harsh soaps until their skin was raw, convinced that cleanliness might protect them from invisible threats. Others turned to alcohol as a disinfectant, rinsing with whiskey, pouring spirits onto wounds, hoping its sting would banish infection. They boiled linens when they could. The water was often scarce and fuel costly. They aired out rooms, lit candles to mask odors, sprinkled perfumes heavy in the air. But perfumes did not kill disease. Candles did not cleanse the air. Many measures were more symbolic than effective, offering comfort without protection. And still they tried, because to do nothing was unthinkable. There was a rhythm to illness in the brothel. One woman would fall sick, and others would carry trays of broth to her bed, whispering comfort, though inside they feared the same fate. Sometimes a madame showed compassion, allowing rest and tending with what remedies she knew. Other times, a woman who could no longer work was turned out, sent into the streets where poverty and sickness entwined like cruel twins. Some drifted into hospitals, though frontier hospitals were grim places, filled with the smell of blood, the cries of the dying, the cold indifference of overworked doctors. Others faded quietly in rented rooms far from the parlor's glow, their absence soon filled by another desperate soul willing to take their place. And yet, for all the despair, there was also remarkable endurance. Women formed bonds of care within the brothel, nursing each other when fevers rose, sharing remedies, offering gentle hands when pain became unbearable. One woman's survival became a collective struggle. They pressed cool cloths to burning foreheads, spooned broth between cracked lips, whispered prayers over the sick. In these moments, the brothel ceased to be merely a place of commerce and became, however briefly, a place of fragile sisterhood. Their compassion did not erase the risks, but it softened the loneliness of suffering, reminding each of them that though society had cast them aside, they were not utterly alone. Opium offered another form of escape, and many turned to it when pain or despair became too heavy. In smoky dens or quiet corners of their rooms, they lit pipes, inhaling deeply until the body floated free of suffering, until the cough quieted, until the ache faded into dreamlike numbness. For some, opium was medicine. For others, it became dependence, a cycle of relief and hunger that bound them even tighter to the life they sought to endure. Alcohol, too, became both salve and poison, numbing minds, easing fear, but leaving the body weaker, more vulnerable to the illnesses already lurking. The madames often stocked their houses with patent medicines, bottles lined up in cupboards with labels promising cures. There were tonics said to strengthen the blood, syrups that promised to banish coughs, powders that claimed to restore youth. Many were nothing but mixtures of alcohol and herbs, designed less to heal than to create the illusion of healing. Yet in a world where real cures were scarce, even illusion held power. A sip of tonic might offer enough hope to carry a woman through another night, enough faith to believe that survival was still possible. Still, the shadow of sickness was relentless. The deadliest nights were not always marked by violence or gunfire. Sometimes they were marked by silence, broken only by the sound of labored breathing, by the rattling cough of a woman fading in her bed. Death did not always come swiftly. Sometimes it lingered, cruelly stretching across weeks or months as bodies weakened, as spirits dimmed, as friends gathered around helpless to change the outcome. And when death came, it was often quiet, unnoticed by the world beyond the brothel walls. A woman's name might vanish from memory, her grave unmarked, her story swallowed by the dust of the plains. But those who endured illness, who fought through fevers and coughed through nights, and still rose to face the dawn, carried with them a strength that cannot be measured. Their survival was not celebrated, not recorded in history, yet it was a triumph nonetheless. They endured what many could not, and in their endurance they revealed the stubborn resilience of the human spirit. To live each night under the shadow of disease, to walk into rooms with the knowledge that sickness might already be lurking in their blood, to laugh and smile while fear gnawed at the edges of their thoughts. This was a courage often overlooked. Their weapons were not only pistols and knives, not only instinct and vigilance, but also sheer determination to rise each day in spite of all that threatened them. And so, in the lamplight of brothels scattered across the Wild West, illness was as constant a companion as laughter or music. It shaped their lives, stole their health, haunted their dreams, and yet it did not silence them completely. They survived as best they could against an enemy they could not see but always felt. And in surviving, they left behind an unspoken testament that even in the darkest, most fragile corners of the frontier, the will to endure was stronger than the shadows that surrounded them. In the shadows of the Wild West brothels, where music drifted through saloon doors and the smell of whiskey hung heavy in the air, survival was not carried by strength alone. Guns and knives could ward off violent men. Quick wit could calm the drunk and dangerous. But there was another kind of strength that sustained these women night after night, year after year. It was the strength they found in each other, the quiet bonds of sisterhood that formed beneath the weight of hardship. For while the outside world often shunned them, within those dimly lit parlors and narrow hallways, they created a community that made survival possible. The brothel was more than a workplace. It was home, shelter, refuge, and sometimes prison, and in this place women leaned on one another in ways that were rarely spoken of, yet deeply felt. Each carried her own story, her own reasons for being there, some driven by poverty, others by betrayal, still others by circumstances they could not control. But together, those stories intertwined, weaving a fragile net of shared experience. In laughter, in sorrow, in whispered confidences, they built connections stronger than the walls around them. The nights were long, and danger lurked both outside and within, but it was during the hours between customers, in the quiet moments, that the bonds of sisterhood revealed themselves. Women shared food at small tables, eating simple meals of bread, beans, or stew, laughing over small jokes to push away the weight of despair. They traded stories of childhood, of faraway towns, of families they might never see again. Some told tales of dreams still alive, dreams of buying a piece of land, of opening a dress shop, of leaving the brothel behind. Others spoke only in fragments, too wounded to share the past, yet grateful for the company of someone who understood. When sickness struck, it was often the women themselves who cared for each other. They took turns sitting at bedsides, wiping sweat from fevered brows, whispering encouragement, and spooning broth into trembling hands. It was a grim ritual, repeated too often, yet it was done with tenderness. They knew too well that tomorrow the same sickness might come for them, and they hoped that when it did, another hand would be there to offer comfort. In those moments, there was no competition, no rivalry, only solidarity born of necessity and compassion. Whispers of warning also passed among them. A man too quick with his temper, a customer known to carry disease, a drifter who refused to pay, these warnings spread quietly from one woman to another, protecting them all. In a world where violence was common and the law unreliable, This sharing of knowledge became its own form of defense. A single warning could mean the difference between safety and injury, between survival and disaster, and so they watched for each other, even when they could not openly admit it. There were lighter moments, too, for even in the harshest lives, laughter finds its place. They helped one another with dresses and hair, shared powders and perfumes, experimented with colors and styles, as though preparing for a grand ball rather than another night of survival. In these rituals of preparation, they found a semblance of normalcy, a reminder of their own womanhood beyond the roles imposed upon them. Sometimes they sang together, their voices blending softly in the parlor as they waited for footsteps at the door. Sometimes they danced, twirling in faded gowns, reclaiming joy if only for a few minutes. These moments did not erase the hardship, but they gave life a sweetness that could be carried into darker hours. For newcomers, the sisterhood was often the only lifeline. A young woman, arriving frightened and uncertain, would find herself guided by older hands, taught how to read men's moods, how to stay safe, how to keep just enough distance between herself and danger. Advice was given freely, not because it guaranteed safety, but because each woman knew what it meant to walk blindly into peril. Some newcomers listened, others did not, but the effort to teach remained, a quiet inheritance passed from one generation of survivors to the next. Not every relationship was gentle. Tensions flared, rivalries surfaced, jealousy and resentment simmered. The close quarters, the competition for money, the presence of alcohol, and the weight of unspoken sorrows often erupted into arguments. Yet even in anger, they remained bound together by circumstance. Fights were followed by reconciliation, harsh words by apologies, for deep down they knew they needed each other more than they needed to be right. The bond was not perfect, but it was real, forged in the fire of shared hardship. In the absence of family, many women created family within the brothel walls. They celebrated birthdays with small gifts or simple songs. They marked holidays with shared meals, sometimes pooling their money for a feast, a piece of cake, a ribbon, a bottle of wine. These small tokens became symbols of belonging. For women who had been cast out by their own kin, who were judged by churches and scorned by neighbors, this chosen family was both precious and fragile. The madames, too, played their part in this fragile network. Some were cruel, exploiting the women without mercy, seeing only profit, but others, hardened by their own journeys, acted as protectors when they could. They enforced rules against violent clients, kept watch over the youngest, and ensured that a measure of safety existed within their walls. They too had once been vulnerable, and though power had changed them, some never forgot what it meant to depend on the kindness of others. In their own way, they became part of the sisterhood, though their role was often complex, balanced between business and care. Beyond the brothel doors, society often branded these women as fallen, as unworthy, as outcasts. Respectable townsfolk might look away when passing them in the street, whisper about them in church pews, or condemn them in sermons. Yet, inside their world, judgment was softened. They knew each other's struggles, understood the choices that had led them here, and rarely asked for explanations. In this shared acceptance, there was a measure of freedom, a release from the need to justify, to pretend, to hide. Within the sisterhood, they were simply themselves, flawed and human, surviving as best they could. Even dreams were shared in these late-night conversations, fragile dreams whispered like prayers. Some spoke of leaving together, of pooling savings to start anew in another town. Others dreamed of building lives beyond survival, lives filled with love, children, homes of their own. These dreams were not always realized, but speaking them aloud gave them weight, gave them shape, and offered comfort. It reminded them that they were more than their present circumstances, that a piece of their hearts still reached for something greater. Tragedy bound them as much as hope. When one of their own died, whether by violence, illness, or despair, it left a hollow place in their hearts. Funerals were rare luxuries, and graves often went unmarked, but within the walls of the brothel, remembrance took other forms. They spoke the woman's name, shared her stories, kept her memory alive in whispers. In doing so, they defied the indifference of the world, ensuring that even the forgotten were remembered by those who had loved them in their final days. This sisterhood was not grand, not perfect, not even always peaceful, but it was real. It was a force that allowed women, cast into one of the harshest roles of the frontier, to endure what might otherwise have broken them. It was the quiet laughter at a shared meal, the soft hand on a fevered brow, the warning whispered in a crowded parlor, the dream spoken into the night. It was the unspoken knowledge that though they stood alone in the eyes of society, within the brothel walls, they were not entirely alone. Through this fragile network of care and connection, they found the strength to face the deadliest nights. They endured the violence, the disease, the despair, because they faced it together. And in their shared endurance, they created something precious, something that history rarely records, but which lived in the hearts of those who survived. The story of the Wild West brothel is often told as one of sin, danger, and decline. But beneath those familiar tales lies this quieter truth, that in the shadows of hardship, women forged bonds strong enough to carry them through the darkest hours. Sisterhood became their weapon, their shield, their comfort. And in those bonds, they discovered a resilience that no bullet, no sickness, no judgment could fully erase. As the lamps burned low and the noise of the saloon faded into the night, the women leaned on one another, waiting for the next dawn. They were not saints, nor were they demons. They were simply human, surviving in the only way they could, holding on to each other in a world that offered little else. Their laughter, their tears, their whispered words of encouragement, these were the threads that stitched their lives together, threads that would never appear in history books, but which carried them through. And so, when we think of the brothels of the Wild West, let us remember not only the danger and despair, but also the sisterhood in the shadows. For it was there, in those fragile connections, that the women found their greatest strength. It was there that they endured the deadliest nights, and it was there that their humanity, so often denied by the world, shone brightest. The brothel doors closed slowly each night, when the final footsteps faded into the darkness of the street, when lanterns sputtered low, and when the last voices of the saloon died to silence. For the women who lived and worked there, survival had always been a question of balancing risk against necessity. They had endured the violence of men, the threat of disease, the weight of exhaustion, and the judgments of the world beyond their walls. Yet even when the deadliest nights passed without incident, a quieter, heavier struggle lingered. The struggle was not always with knives, pistols, or fevers. Sometimes the deadliest battles were invisible, waged in silence, fought only within the heart. Loneliness was among the fiercest of these unseen enemies. Each night, the women entertained men who sought their company, their laughter, their touch, but these encounters rarely offered true companionship. Once the door closed and the money was pocketed, intimacy dissolved into emptiness. The women smiled and soothed, but when the night ended, they were left alone with their own thoughts, their own doubts, their own longing for something genuine. Behind the painted smiles and the practiced charm was often a quiet yearning for connection that could not be bought or sold. And so, the nights stretched long, filled with noise, but also with aching silence. Despair followed closely behind loneliness, creeping in during the hours between dusk and dawn. Some women dulled it with alcohol, drinking deeply to push back the weight of memory, of regret, of dreams deferred. Others sought escape in opium smoke, drifting into a haze where pain and fear lost their sharpness, where the world became distant and forgiving. These escapes offered temporary relief, but when the effects faded, despair returned, often heavier than before. It was a cycle many could not break, a slow surrender to shadows that grew stronger with each passing year, yet not all succumbed. Many clung fiercely to fragile threads of hope, weaving them into dreams of futures beyond the brothel. They dreamed of saving enough money to buy a small home, of starting a business, of leaving the past behind and beginning again in a place where no one knew their names. These dreams, though often delayed or lost, gave them something to reach for. In whispered conversations with trusted friends, they spoke of these hopes, giving them life, even if only in words. Hope itself became a form of endurance, a shield against despair, a light that flickered but refused to go out. There were women who managed to leave, though their journeys were rarely easy, some married clients who grew fond of them, exchanging a life of survival for one of uncertain domesticity. Others simply walked away, traveling to new towns where they reinvented themselves under new names, carrying secrets they never shared. A few succeeded in saving money, enough to open boarding houses, laundries, or small shops, transforming their futures through sheer determination. These stories of escape were rare, but they mattered deeply. For every woman who left, others saw proof that change, however difficult, was possible. For those who remained, endurance itself became a kind of victory. To rise each day after surviving another night, to continue working despite illness, loss, or sorrow, was an act of strength. Their survival was not celebrated in newspapers, nor honored in public memory, but it was no less remarkable. They carried on in a world stacked against them, bearing burdens most could not imagine, and still they found ways to laugh, to care for one another, to dream. This resilience was their quiet legacy, one not written in grand histories, but lived in the small, unrecorded moments of their lives. The legacy of these women stretches further than their own time, though history often forgets their names. They were part of the foundation of frontier towns, shaping economies, influencing communities, contributing to the social fabric in ways rarely acknowledged. Brothels brought money into towns, supported saloons, hotels, and shops, and even funded civic projects through the fines and taxes imposed upon them. Beyond economics, the presence of these women revealed the contradictions of the Wild West, a society that condemned them publicly yet relied upon them privately, that labeled them sinful yet profited from their existence. Their lives exposed the truths others wished to ignore, and in doing so, they became mirrors of the world around them. The deadliest nights, then, were not always nights of bullets or sickness, but nights when the weight of existence pressed hardest upon their souls. Nights when the laughter faded, when dreams seemed unreachable, when despair whispered louder than hope. Yet even in those moments, many endured. They held on to friendships, to rituals of sisterhood, to fleeting joys, and to the stubborn belief that life might one day be different. That endurance itself was extraordinary, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be crushed completely, even under the harshest of circumstances. Imagine one of these women at dawn, standing at a window as the first light touched the dusty street outside. The saloon was quiet, the music gone, the revelry finished. She leaned against the frame, weary from the night's labor, her eyes heavy but still searching the horizon. In that moment, she was more than her role, more than the judgments cast upon her. She was a survivor, a dreamer, a human being carrying both sorrow and strength. She might have felt forgotten by the world, but in truth, her endurance was shaping a legacy far beyond her own awareness. For the story of the Wild West is incomplete without her and others like her. They were not merely footnotes in history, nor faceless figures in old photographs. They were women who lived through danger, who faced illness and violence, who laughed and wept, who dreamed and despaired, and who, above all, endured. Their lives remind us that history is not only made by sheriffs, outlaws, or pioneers, but also by those whose stories are whispered, hidden, and nearly lost. The brothel workers of the Wild West carried within them the resilience of countless forgotten souls, and their strength still echoes in the silent plains. And so, as the tale of these women draws to a close, let us not see them only as shadows in a lawless past. Let us see them as voices of endurance, as hearts that beat strongly against the odds, as spirits that refused to be broken. They survived the deadliest nights not only with weapons or cleverness, but with courage, sisterhood, and the fragile yet powerful flame of hope. In remembering them, we honor not only their struggle, but the universal truth they embodied, that even in the darkest times, the human spirit is capable of extraordinary resilience. As you drift into rest, let the echo of their story remain. The women of the Wild West brothels were more than their struggles, more than their pain. They were bearers of unyielding strength, survivors of nights that would have broken many, keepers of dreams that refused to die. Their legacy is not written in stone, but in the endurance that still inspires, reminding us that even in the harshest of worlds, light can be found in the most unexpected places. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well and let your dreams be gentle. If this journey through history eased your mind, please like and share, and don't forget to subscribe for more quiet stories from the past.